All right. Well, anyway, thank you for joining us. Welcome everyone to our Global Thought session. This is Collin Laverty from Havana Strategies and from Cuba Educational Travel. I've invited him to talk about Cuba, especially now after the Biden win in the presidential election. I think we all have a lot of questions about Cuba. What are the next steps? How can we proceed? What will this mean for U.S. citizens who are trying to travel or to study in Cuba? So these are just some things we hope that Collin can talk about with us. Okay, so let me just get going. Collin, again, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it.
For sure. Thank you, Tom. I really appreciate it, the
So,
opportunity to be here.
so let's. I guess I'll start with the first question. Is how did you become interested in Cuba?
Um, so it's not that long of a story. I feel like most people that work on Cuba have a Cuba story, and it often involves becoming kind of captivated or drawn in. And so I'm not that different, but my story largely involves studying in Cuba. I did go as a teenager. My brother and I convinced my dad one holiday vacation to kind of sneak down to Cuba from Canada. We were only teenagers. I actually wanted to go somewhere else. I think I was 14 and my brother was 16. And my brother nudged me and said, Dad's crazy enough to do this. We'll be the only kids in our whole high school to go to Cuba. And so we went and we had a wonderful time. Probably the most distinctive thing that I remember was it coincided with the Elian Gonzalez case. And so I remember stumbling upon one of those marches that Fidel Castro had organized for 1 million or more people to demand Elian's return. But in any case, it was just kind of a normal, a wonderful visit, but I didn't know that it would play such a big impact on my life. Years later, when I was in college, I studied undergrad at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. And my senior year in 2005, the school happened to be one of the very few schools that scrambled to kind of accommodate to new regulations that were put in to place on study abroad programs, well, travel and commerce with Cuba altogether, but particularly with educational programs, the Bush administration had made things really difficult with new requirements. And of the hundreds of programs that existed, most of them were eliminated overnight. And the College of Charleston was one of those schools that scrambled to comply with the new restrictions. And so they went from having a short summer program to having there was only 4 or 5 semester long programs that fall of 2005. And anyways, it became really attractive to me once it was a semester long program and kind of the forbidden fruit. No other student, I was going to be one of just a handful of students there. And so I went and, really, I think the people who were incredibly, wonderful. And I think anyone who has experience with Cuba would probably share that thought. But I think also there was 2 other factors. One was kind of intellectually how stimulating the place is, just because it's so different, it's so complex, it's so, you're always trying to figure out how it really works. Most of the times you kind of leave with more questions than you arrive with. So that really kind of drew me in. And then the other issue was with US policy. I felt really strongly after spending a few months there, which I still feel strongly about, that US policy, if our goal is to push for a more open economy and a more open society, US policy for a long time has had the exact opposite impact in terms of just giving the Cuban people options for their future and playing a more direct role in their future and having a better life. And so that also really incentivized me to want to work on Cuba. And so when I finished school, I moved to Washington and I got started on working on US policy towards Cuba. And really I've spent my whole adult life doing different things that revolve around, travel, culture, business, but always with Cuba.
Oh, great. No, I think you are completely right. I mean, Cuba just has this allure for many Americans, and and John, who I see here, I've mentioned this to him, but I always tell a lot of my students or faculty members that for many Americans, Cuban history begins in 1959 with the triumph of the revolution. We have Fidel, you have Che Guevara, Cienfuegos. But then beyond that, many Americans don't really know about the history that happened, with Batista, Frank Pais, and some of these other things. It seems like Americans' conception is very, very limited in terms of engaging Cuba and its imagination. That's why I think your work is very extremely important right now, especially with the group that we have in Miami, the Cuban exile group that's really pressing hard to present a certain image of Cuba, and Americans don't have any counterbalance to that to really show people. It's like, hey, no, it's not what this side is saying. This is what the real picture is in Cuba. So again, I want to thank you for the work that you do, Collin. It's extremely valuable.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit more. First about Cuba Educational Travel. How did you start that?
So very organically, as I mentioned, I was in Washington for probably 3 or 4 years working on U.S. policy towards Cuba. I worked at a place called the Center for Democracy in the Americas, and amongst other things, did a lot of congressional travel and travel for kind of thought leaders and politicians from the U.S. to Cuba, with the idea that bringing them down there, allowing them to meet not only government officials, but civil society and just normal Cubans, they'd be able to better assess whether U.S. policy was effective and achieving its goals and whether the goals were okay. And so in any case, I did that for a number of years. And then when I went back to school at UC San Diego, where I did a master's in international relations. And kind of in my second year, I can't say, it was probably at the beginning of my second year when I more intensely was thinking about what I wanted to do after finishing my master's. I was doing a lot of work on Brazil at the time. I won a fellowship to focus on Brazil. So I was down there a lot and really looking at working on Brazil, which I'm glad I did. Brazil's a beautiful, interesting country. What I realized through working on Brazil was that Cuba was really where my heart was. It was where my skill set and my knowledge base was, and that I wanted to go back to working on Cuba. That coincided with really two things. One, there was a process of reform in Cuba that was, relatively new at that stage, just a couple of years in the making of Raul Castro really opening up the economy, and a series of other reforms that were kind of changing the way Cuba, the present and the future of Cuba, which was important. And I wanted to better understand and kind of be there for. And, Barack Obama had become president, and he was starting to change US policy towards Cuba. So both of those things really pulled me in. And I just felt it's a country that I love and that I've worked on for the last several years. And I want to be part of this process. And as I looked at whether I would go back to Washington and work on policy, and no offense, Washington, a city that I love, and think tanks that, I'm on the board of several and I love them, I didn't want to go back and be in DC. I wanted to kind of be on the ground and build new relationships and new networks and gain different knowledge. And the one thing that you could really do to spend a lot of time in Cuba and have an income was travel. It was one of the only legal ways to do business. And it was certainly a way to kind of have one foot in each place and strategically meet a lot of different people on both sides and kind of play a role in this change that was happening both in Cuba and in US policy towards Cuba. And so that's what, I started to look at it. And, as I mentioned, I'd already had years of experience of organizing kind of small congressional delegations and other fact-finding trips. And as I started to do market research, folks that were, familiar with Cuba at that time will remember, the National Geographic trips for $8,000 for 6 days, and or even Insight Cuba for $5,000 for a long weekend in Havana. And so as I started to look at, and no offense to either of those, which are great companies or organizations that were offering a great product, but as I started to look at it, I said, look, I know a lot of wonderful people in Cuba. I could put together really impactful and attractive itineraries, and I could also probably do it at half the price that most of these companies are doing it at, and make money and spread that money around. So that's what I did, and that's how I started Cuba Educational Travel.
I think one of the things I liked, and I think you know this, and I think John knows this, was about the Roomba diplomacy in the 90s. And that's where Ry Cooder went to Cuba and he discovered the Buena Vista Social Club. And that started this movement of Cuban musicians and artists to the United States. And I think you did this with Sima Funk, right? Sima Funk, the Cuban
Yeah.
artist. Did you have any problems? I was always amazed at how were you able to get the visa for him to come to the States?
Yeah. So, I mean, I agree with you that cultural travel is essential and it's been really important. And if you remember, you know, during kind of the more interesting um, years during the Obama administration of opening up, a lot of the support, I mean, there was different elements, but a lot of support for his policy was through, the cultural diplomacy. You have Rolling Stones, you had Diplo giving a concert, you had Cuban bands coming here. And that's, I think, really important because if you look at what happened under the Trump administration, we went from a period where, Winston Marsalis, and Cubans are at Lincoln Center, and that's front page of the New York Times for the right reason, right? We're excited, it's cool, it's sexy, it's fun, it's romantic, it's kind of the best of Cuba. And then we went to a narrative of, there's these weird sonic attacks at the embassy or these other things. And so I think the narrative is really important in terms of particularly the general American public, right? In terms of their desire to travel to Cuba, their desire to host Cuban dance groups here. And so I do hope with the Biden administration that they'll focus, you mentioned Miami in the opening. And I think one of the more concerning things was we finally did get to a point, a decade ago, really, that the same Cuban band could play in Havana on Friday night and Miami on Saturday night, right? And if you go back 3 decades, ago, there was bomb threats or there was people waiting for them at the airport to throw eggs at them because anyone who came from Cuba, even if they were a musician, they were sent by Fidel Castro. We finally got to a point where there was kind of this harmony between South Florida and Cuba. And I think that really scared opponents of engagement in South Florida. And you have to give them credit. Strategically, they attacked that. And we're now, unfortunately, back at a point where they're pushing that no Cuban artists can have visas, that they shouldn't be able to perform in Miami. And I think it's sad because the losers are Cubans on both sides, the Cubans in Miami who want to hear that music or see that play or take part of it. And of course, the Cuban musicians that are traveling, their families that they're supporting. So I think that's super important. I think it's important to also realize, and I think the Biden administration is probably starting to get into the weeds on this. The Trump administration did a lot to harm relations and to turn back what the Obama administration had accomplished over 8 years, but really over kind of less than 2 years, where they really put the burner on. And despite the rhetoric and really harmful policies, a lot of what Obama did is still in place, and it continued to be in place under Trump. So when you look at the cultural exchange stuff, fortunately, the Trump administration never went back to what George Bush had done post 2004, where no Cubans could get, no academics, no musicians could get visas to the U.S. That never happened. So, luckily we have professionals at State Department that in most cases continued to give visas to Cuban musicians. There's obviously, there's very concrete things that the Biden administration can do to enhance that and really get it to where it has to be, not specific to culture exchange, but with Cubans in general. We saw the Trump administration cancel the 5-year multiple entry visa, which had a really profound impact on Cuban entrepreneurs and kind of the average Cuban that has family here. And so I hope we'll see a series of things like that the Biden administration can do. And, they might not be the headline grabbing measures, but I think they will really have an impact on the lives of people on both sides of the Florida Straits.
I completely agree with you, and I think John, our colleague here, John McAuliffe, had once said to me, it's a lot of what Trump did is it's smoke and mirrors, and people really they react out of fear, but also because they're not as well informed about U.S. policy towards Cuba. One of the things I've been doing lately is, do you know Michael Gozak? I think he's with the U.S. State Department. He's been tweeting things, really ridiculous things about Cuba lately, and some of them I wrote back one time because he said, we are supporting the democratic transition of government in Venezuela. I said, well, this is ironic because you're not doing that here in the States. But we have figures like him. And then, now this other person, I forgot her name, Salazar in Miami, I think. What's it? Maria Elvira Salazar, I think. And she is really scares me, actually. I think in terms of she's going to be presenting another challenge to trying to keep open relations with Cuba. What is your sense of her?
Um, well, I think she's symbolic of a handful of things, but I think one of them that I kind of alluded to was this changing narrative in Miami. And I think that when the Obama administration had a policy of kind of focusing on not only Cuba policy, but the lives of Cuban Americans, and their messaging was about engaging Cuban families, empowering Cubans on both sides of the straits, of the Florida Straits. They really won the hearts and minds of a lot of people in South Florida. Again, the message was very much about uniting, about empowering, about helping. Over the last 4 years, and this is larger when you look at kind of everything that's going on in the United States with politics and divisions and polarization. But the tone has largely gone back to what I alluded to a few minutes ago with, the eggs being thrown at people, and anyone who doesn't explicitly agree with you, they're labeled, kind of the worst thing. And unfortunately in South Florida, they're labeled a communist, regardless of their political beliefs. And we've seen that over the last 4 years, where there was kind of like this repudiation of anyone who was pro-engagement or not even sympathetic to Cuba, but just wanted to have a relationship with the Cuban people. And so Salazar is largely kind of part of that shifting narrative over the last 4 years in South Florida that's been kind of very anti-socialist. You look at her opponent, who she defeated, Donna Shalala, she was kind of halfway on engagement with Cuba. She wasn't even against the embargo. She worked for the Clinton administration. She's about as establishment as it can get, and very far from being a socialist or, a socialist sympathizer. So unfortunately, I think, Salazar is a product of that environment. And I think the Biden administration is going to have to think strongly about how to deal with that, that environment, not only on Cuba policy, because, most of the polls show that, Cubans in the United States, whether they're second or third generation and they were born here or they came from Cuba over the last decade or 2 decades, Cuba policy often is not the primary issue for them. They're more worried about general foreign policy or healthcare or the economy or COVID. But in any case, I think the Biden administration is going to have to think about, what it does, not only with Cuba, but other issues, how to engage the Cuban American community so that this narrative that's, really intensified, over the last 4 years, but particularly the last year. And Cuba kind of gets, because Cuba is a socialist country and because there's that relationship between South Florida and Cuba, and there's the Venezuela issue, it kind of all gets wrapped in. And Salazar was able to take advantage of that, and she won. And I'd just say, my biggest concern there, well, I think there's two, but there's probably several. But one is, we were moving to a moment, or we were at a moment where many members of the Florida congressional delegation supported engagement. And that's something that was very new. You go back not too long ago and nobody in Florida, regardless of party or where their congressional district is, would support engagement with Cuba. And that was slowly shifting. And I think in the long run, that'll continue to happen. But Salazar and Carlos Jimenez both won, and they're both pro-embargo. So it kind of reinforces this notion of a monopoly on the issue by Cuban American lawmakers in both houses. So I think that's concerning. I think the other thing is, without getting into politics, that's the district, I think, or one of the districts in the United States that has the most people on the Affordable Care Act in the whole country, percentage-wise. And she's a proponent of removing the Affordable Care Act. So I do worry about her constituents ending up without health care.
Okay, just one more question for you, and then we'll turn it over to whoever would like to ask a question or any final comments from you. I'm just going to share the screen here because I just wanted to, I wanted the people to see your the links for some of your programs. So I'll just bear with me a little bit, people, and then we're going to go see the. There you go. There's some links here. So you have, the Cuba Educational Travel, which you just spoke of. Could you tell us a little bit more about the Havana Strategies and the one I'm really excited about, the 90 Miles podcast?
Yes, for sure. Havana Strategies, also very organic in the sense that when the Obama administration started to open up more in terms of Cuba, 2015, 2016, 2017, a lot of former travelers, people that had traveled to Cuba with me under Cuba Educational Travel, from different sectors in the business community, were excited about looking at opportunities in Cuba, but couldn't really figure out how to explore those opportunities. If we think back during those days, there was like this great, on the one hand, optimism, which I think was valid. There was also kind of this misconception by industries of all scale and kind of type of industry that they were going to quickly get into Cuba after 50 years. And we're talking about, the guy with a small lawnmower shop in Nebraska. And it's kind of, so anyways, the Cuban government was completely overwhelmed with requests from, everyone from, the Coca-Colas and the airlines and the cell phone companies to kind of smaller industries and smaller projects. So there was a lot of frustration and kind of confusion amongst the business community that was trying to figure things out. And very organically, a handful of different individuals or companies contacted me, kind of trying to figure out how do we, go to Cuba to explore opportunities and and that's how it started. And then really got into, Cuba 101 with several of these companies in terms of helping them explore the market, and the ones that were successful, kind of helping their operations get off the ground. And so, it's a boutique consultancy, and I've worked with a dozen or so major US companies on different market entry projects in Cuba. And thankfully, a handful of those actually, despite the challenges on both sides, were able to get off the ground and start operating. And so that's essentially Havana Strategies. And then the last link that you provided, the 90 Miles podcast, that is the result of COVID, in the sense I was working with Google and a handful of other people and companies on some projects involving Cuban entrepreneurs. And a lot of that had to do with events and travel. We were planning on bringing them up to the US, and because of COVID, that couldn't happen. And that slowly migrated into a podcast. And so I'm one of the hosts. It's a kind of a cooperative of a handful of Americans that, work on Cuba, love Cuba, Cubans that are either in Cuba or the United States. And so it's Americans, Cubans. And we put out podcasts about every 2 weeks, and it's largely focused on kind of entrepreneurship and the arts. So we've had a handful of Cuba's leading entrepreneurs and musicians talking, really telling their stories, which are quite empowering when you listen to them. And then, we also will bring in commentary from experts and analysts. So we were lucky on the first two episodes to have Jeff De Laurentiis, who was the head of the intersection, eventually the embassy under Obama. He joins us for commentary on the first two. The last episode, we had Michael Bustamante, that was focused on the Cuban American vote and its implications kind of for US policy, which I thought was really interesting. And then this week we'll have a special episode with Mark Fierstein, who was a special advisor for the Obama administration on Latin America. He did a lot of work on Cuba, including the negotiating the deal between Major League Baseball and Cuban Sports Federation. And so we'll be talking to him about what to expect with a Biden administration, its policy towards Cuba.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed listening to those podcasts. And for anyone who didn't write down those links, that's okay. I'll forward them to you afterwards. But now I turn the mic over to you. To anyone who has any questions, please, or any final thoughts, Collin.
I see John with a question. I don't have any final thoughts.
Well, I was wondering, it's a small enough group, Tom, if you wanted to introduce everybody who's on the call, just to start off, and then there are a couple of things I wanted to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's yes. For those of you, please feel free to introduce yourselves.
I can jump in real quick. I'm Lucinda Morgan, Director of International Education at Allegheny College. So I'm north of Pittsburgh, south of Erie in Pennsylvania.
Didalis, you're on mute still. Okay. In the meantime, Lauren, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Lauren. I am a study abroad coordinator at Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama. So I'm joining this call today because we've offered a program to Cuba in the past through the Honors College, and hopefully more programs to come once the world opens up to international travel safely.
And Didalis, still we can't seem to get you unmuted. I'll introduce. Oh, there you go. There you go.
Okay. I'm Didalis. I work with Tom. I used to be a professor in the Center for the Study of the Cuban Economy at the University of Havana. Now I'm here in New York. I work on Harvard College. It's Tom.
Okay, well, my first question, Collin, is where are you?
I'm in Arizona. I'm visiting family.
So. That didn't look like Florida or Cuba. So.
Yeah.
Is that your parents in the background, or?
That I have not gotten a chance to mute and yell at my dad. I told him to be quiet.
Oh, he said there's no noise problem. You see them walking by the cactus.
Yeah, exactly.
Back of you over your shoulder. So.
Yeah, that's my father. But I was in Cuba the last 7 months. So I spent from February until about a month ago in Cuba. So happy to talk about that experience with COVID. And then I was in Florida for about 3 weeks around the election. I'm a Florida resident, so I voted in, actually Salazar won the district that I live in. So I was there for the election, not only the vote, but I think really to kind of see what was going on. And then I've been in Arizona for about a week.
Okay. Well, one of the questions I had about the election, and I'm sure you're seeing all the things I'm seeing of Cuba Study Group just put out a long commentary with lots of different people's opinion about it. But one of the frustrations with Shalala in particular, and with the Colombian woman,
Debbie Mercasol Powell.
Yeah, who also lost his. Your characterization was correct. They took a slightly more engagement position than conventional wisdom may have been, but they didn't fight for it. They were totally on the defensive. And I don't know whether the Biden people did anything to fight for the Cuban American opinion, whether they, there were those three obvious issues of remittances, travel, and visas for family visits and immigration. And it didn't look from far away that they really hammered those issues down in the community, saying, we're going to do the stuff that will make your life and your family's life in Cuba better. And I didn't sense, I kept getting funding requests from Donna, but I didn't get any sense from her either that she was fighting on behalf of the people who had gotten screwed by Trump. Did you, in the time in Miami, did you get any further sense of that?
No, I mean, I think there was all kinds of factors. I do think that community, to be effective, you need to get out. And so I do think, just in, not on the Cuba issue, but in general, the Republicans had the advantage because they were canvassing, they were knocking door to door when the Biden administration had a policy of kind of doing everything over the phone. So I think that helped them control the message. I think that, similar to the rest of, a lot of the issues that we're hearing about nationally, but there really is a new media ecosystem in South Florida, and it's never been a very diverse, kind of two-sided media ecosystem. We've seen that get even worse over the last 2 years. And so there was almost like a machinery that, not only was the other message dominant, but like, I think the Biden or the pro-engagement didn't even have access to that machinery. So I think that those were all issues. And, I think it was really tough. Like, I think a lot of us would have liked to seen Shalala and Debbie Merkersol-Powell be more out front on the Cuba issue, but, they have complicated districts, not only on the Cuba issue, but now the Venezuela, it's more recent, it's even more emotional because it's more new. And there's kind of like a spillover and amplifying effect with the Cuba issue. And so I just think and this isn't, justifying their lack of supporting a policy that supports their constituents and their family in Cuba. I think they should have done more, but I do think those were really messy districts with a lot of complications. And, they didn't lose on the Cuba issue, they lost on the anti-socialist issue. And I mean, if you were in South Florida, it's just, they were painted, all you would see on television was Debbie Merkersol-Powell with AOC and Bernie Sanders. And then, the next thing was Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, and they were all socialist, and they drove that home. And so it almost made it difficult for them to deal with. And I think the Biden administration came up short on the Cuba issue, but just in general, their position, it was too little too late. And it was kind of, we're not socialist, I'm not a socialist, rather than, government is okay, this is what government does, healthcare, whatever their message was, they were on the defense, and it was too little, too late. And I think that's concerning. And I think it's concerning in terms of, as we look forward to what to expect from this administration on Cuba, I hope that they understand that when the Obama administration had a policy and had a message and pushed its policy and its message out in the community, it was popular and it won votes. And then the Trump administration had a policy and it had a message, and it was also popular and it won votes. But one was about empowering the Cuban people, the other one was about punishing the Cuban military or the Cuban state. And so I think the Biden administration has to think about that, and they have to think about, what's the right thing to do? And I hope that is the most important. And then once they figure that out, how do we kind of push that forward? And
yeah, I think there's a real battle going on right now. A lot of pushback, as happened in the beginning of the first Obama term, or even in the Obama transition, that people who were Democrats and supported the candidacy, but had a fairly traditionalist position about Cuba, put a lot of pressure on to roll it back, to roll back what Obama had said, which happily, in terms of Cuban Americans, he didn't do. We remember that he opened it up totally for remittances and totally for travel, which was an important tactical step, and as well as an in principle step. But he was defying the people who had supported him, the Cuban American National Foundation and some opinion leaders in Miami. So I think that's the question right now, is will the Biden people, as you say, go for what's correct and where they started out, or will they back down in the face of this kind of pressure?
Yeah.
But anyway, I had another question on the Cuban side, which is the COVID issue. American is announcing flights again, and yes, JetBlue also. The Cubans are saying that they're going to do testing with people when they arrive. They're not doing what some countries are, at least so far, they're not doing what Costa Rica and some other places are doing, saying you have to have a test before you leave the US. But, on the one hand, they obviously desperately need as much traffic as possible from the US, but on the other, we see all around us that the US is about the worst country in the world on the COVID front. And how do you sense they're going to balance and control that, especially when, by definition, even under the support for the Cuban people, which is about the only license left for most people, they can't do what the Cubans were trying to do, which is to push foreigners into resort areas and keep them contained. So I don't know what your sense is of how that's going to fit together over the next several months.
Yeah, I think that I think it's a challenge. I think that, as you mentioned, there's obviously the economic strains and, the need to open up to some extent to keep the economy moving, the formal economy, the informal economy. And I think that on the one hand, Cubans are very pleased with the way that their government has handled COVID. And I think it's like a reassuring thing. A lot of Cubans have a lot of complaints about their government and kind of shortcomings in different areas. And I think this was probably, one area where most Cubans feel their government did a pretty good job and they're happy about that. But it did get to a point where, after months and months and months of not lockdown, but significant restrictions and lockdown, at some point, I think people wanted things to open up, both domestically and internationally. And obviously, as you mentioned, there's incentives. And I think the risk is they've done such a good job. They're just over, I think, 131 deaths and 7,000 or 8,000 cases, and really textbook in terms of dealing with it, in terms of research and contact tracing and isolation. Something to be proud of. And I think there's concern among some, like, what happens when you do open up? Do you lose everything that you gained, both in terms of the health advances, the prestige of being able to control it, et cetera? So I think that's a problem. What I worry the most about, I did, at one point I went to a hotel kind of when they slowly started to open up the tourist facility, and I was impressed with, the way that they were handling it in terms of masks everywhere, taking people's temperature, spreading people out. And so I feel pretty good about visitors going and them being able to control it. And I actually they just sent me all the guidelines of when you arrive and you get your test and what you're allowed to do, what you can't do, if somebody's positive, what the protocol is, et cetera. I think they'll do okay in terms of travelers, because it's just easier when they have them confined, and it's easier to contact trace. They don't know as many people, all of these things. And so all the guidelines are there. If a traveler's found sick, where they'll be isolated depending on how severe their symptoms are. Where I'm most concerned is with Cuban Americans, because many are coming from South Florida, where there's a lot of cases, number one. And then number two, they get tested upon arrival, but then it usually takes 12 to 24 hours before the results are ready, and then they would contact them. Not all, and I don't want to stereotype, but just thinking of some of my friends, within 24 hours, many Cubans that haven't been to Cuba in a year or two have already seen like 75 people. And so, the risk of spread within that 24-hour period is quite significant. So I think, we'll have to see it. They started yesterday, and who knows if they'll adapt. I agree with you that it would be nice if there was maybe a pre-flight test combined with testing upon arrival. But we'll just have to see what they do.
Any other questions? Lucinda?
Yeah, it's not like directly related to like study away or anything, but just how widespread was COVID amongst the population in Cuba? And it's hard to tell that too, but I didn't know how much it spread there.
Yeah, I'd say relatively low compared to, compared to other places. You know, just thinking back, the first case was in March, and it was Italian tourists that were in Trinidad and tested positive. And then pretty soon after, you know, other cases started to come about, but they never, you know, they were always doing a lot of testing. They were doing a lot of, as I mentioned, contact tracing. So like they were ready, right? When those Italians tested positive, they grabbed everyone who had been in touch with them, everyone who had been in touch with them, and everyone who had been in touch with them. And so immediately, you know, there's 2 or 3 positives and there's like 600 people isolated and tested. And, you know, they did that for months and months until, you know, maybe about a month ago that they said, you know, this isn't sustainable. We're going to continue to hospitalize everyone who has it. And, you know, high risk cases will isolate them, but we can't, you know, they said the numbers at that time. They said, you know, we have 3,000 people isolated right now in hotels or work centers, and they're there for like, you know, a week or 2 each. And so I think it was costly and it was like logistically challenging. But, you know, those things really made the difference. And so we never got to a point, there was very few days where there was more than 100 positives. You know, there was many times over the last 7 or 8 months where there was 0 cases in, you know, the majority of the provinces, and there'd be, you know, 2 new cases, 3 new cases, 20 cases. And that was, you know, that was within the context of them, you know, isolating everyone who's exposed and then also randomly testing people. So I'd say the average over the last 7 months has been like a little over 3,000 tests per day. And so it's quite good, right? When you're testing 3,000-4,000 people and you're only getting 4 or 5 positives back, or even 100 positives. So I think they've done well. And I haven't seen a side-by-side lately, probably because everyone has fatigue we've just been dealing with this for so long. But throughout the crisis, when you looked at side-by-side comparisons with like Cuba and other countries in the region, there, you know, the level of positives was way below. And then the numbers of deaths in most cases was significantly below. So I'd say they've done pretty well.
Thank you.
Hi, Collin. I was wondering if you could speak about, you know, study abroad in Cuba, and kind of, you know, view on that, how we can promote it to students, you know, a little bit about your experience as a student going to Cuba, and maybe more about your business for study abroad in Cuba.
Terrific. Yeah. And sorry if instead of talking about study abroad, we delved into like really deep political issues for the last 49 minutes. In terms of study abroad, I mean, one would be a pitch. I studied, when I was in college, I studied in Chile and I studied in Cuba. And this isn't to compare, but I feel like Chile was an incredible and a life-changing experience in some ways. But like Cuba was a transformative experience for me just because it's so unique. And I mentioned this in the beginning. And so, you know, at the time there was 3 different currencies. Now there's 2 different currencies. There's, you know, a currency reform happening. There's this terribly complicated relationship with the United States. There's internal reform. There's all kinds of contradictions and complexities when you look at issues of human rights and like just everything, internal politics. And so from that point, you know, it's one of the, I would say, one of the more interesting places to study. It's just really powerful. And when you combine that with the fact that, you know, it's like you're going somewhere, you know, a world away, but it's very close. And then it's very safe. And despite this kind of, challenging, complicated relationship between the two governments, the relationship between the people is, one of, I think, great admiration and respect and openness. And so it's a super safe place and a very warm and friendly place. So there's, again, I don't want to compare or downplay other places, but I feel it's very unique in that sense, where you'll find students that, within a few days of being in Cuba, they're having coffee inside the neighbor's home, or they're, playing dominoes down the street with kids their age that in many societies it would take, weeks, months, or lifetime to meet those types of relationships. And in Cuba, you often find them in a matter of days, and people are open. And, so I think that's incredibly unique and powerful. And like, we see that whether it's, a 1 week or a 2 week exchange or a semester long exchange, just these relationships that are able, that they're able to construct, I think is really powerful. So those would be the big things. I would say, that in general, like working with schools that are new to Cuba, it's a challenge to get it started at first because it's different. So there's learning curves, I think, on both sides, both like interacting with the institutions on the Cuban side. And then also, Tom and I were talking about this before, but also like, helping bring members of your institution along to understand the complexities of Cuba. And so it is, it can be complicated. And so I think many times you need a champion, somebody that's excited about it and wants it to happen, just to get it over that initial hump in the beginning. And I do think, this isn't a sell on my company particularly, but there are a handful of people and organizations that have been out there for a while. So I do think, in the beginning, it's often good to partner with people that have been doing it for a while, just so that they can help you with the shortcuts and the messaging vis-a-vis partners on both sides. So that's a general spiel, but I don't know if I got to the bulk of your question.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Thanks for relating it to study abroad for those of us that work in international education.
For sure.
Let's see. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if not, Collin, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and for your expertise. What Abroad is going to do is we will be making a donation to a school in Old Havana in your name. So thank you very much for that. And just for the others, before we head out, I just want to let you know about some upcoming speakers that we have as part of International Education Week. Tomorrow we have Dr. Harvey Charles. He's going to talk about what state international education is going to be after the pandemic. That's going to be very interesting. This is one I'm very excited about, a debate on which is the better option for study abroad, remaining traditional or going online. These are two big names in the field. I think you'll like that. And this is the one I'm very excited about too. Shavana Basij-Rasik will be talking about education in Afghanistan. This is going to be on November 19th at 2:00 p.m. And then we're going to end the week with Dr. Christoph Van Maal, who's going to talk about study abroad, student mobility, and labor outcomes. So he has some very interesting arguments that not everyone in international education agree with. So I hope you can join us for that. Again, thank you very, very much, Collin. I really appreciate your time, and I hope we can work together again sometime. John, Daelis, Lucinda, Lauren, thank you very much for joining us. I hope to see you around sometime soon.
Thanks,
thank
everyone.
you for arranging it, Tom, and thank you, Collin.
All right, thank you very much, guys. Have a nice day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.